Hello, my name is Jordan, and I have done my case study on the Sparrow test. The Sparrow test exists due to a man by the name of Ronald Sparrow. Sparrow was a Musqueam band member who was arrested for fishing on his territory with too long of a net than allowed by the fishing industry. Sparrow was not the first to do this, as this restriction was mostly ignored by the Musqueam community as it altered their way of life. When arrested, the Musqueam community provided aid to Sparrow for him and their own rights which were being infringed upon, and defended him in court. 6 years after Sparrow's arrest, the Musqueam community won their appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. With this victory, a new precedent was set considering infringing Aboriginal rights. This precedent was coined the Sparrow test. In this slideshow, we will delve deep into the case of R.V. Sparrow, attempt to better understand the historical context of Sparrow, further understand how Sparrow was a confusing victory and the impact of that. Then I will explain legal and constitutional issues revolving around the Sparrow case and the impact Sparrow had on contemporary law. Firstly, though, it is important to have some background on the Musqueam land which everything took place. The Musqueam community and their ancestors have inhabited the Fraser River estuary for millennia. The Fraser River exits southwest of British Columbia, just north of Victoria, and extends through Burnaby, Abbotsford, and Chilliwack. The name Musqueam relates to the name of rivergrass. This is because of the variety of flourishment of the rivergrass. Some areas would be scarce, and some very lively. The Musqueam people related to this in times of war or sickness, thus nicknamed themselves people of the rivergrass. The land itself is filled with life and has been used to keep the Musqueam community and many other communities alive for generations. As mentioned previously, there was a food fishing license given to the Aboriginal peoples within the Musqueam community. This food fishing license was used as a restriction so that Aboriginal fishers would have less control over the fishing industry. Ronald Sparrow was one of the many who ignored this fishing restriction and was arrested for this. This arrest angered the Musqueam community, who chose to defend Sparrow in court. The Musqueam community had 5 main arguments to defend Sparrow. These were: the Musqueam retained their right to fish on their territories, their rights to fish have never been extinguished by treaty, Section 35 of the Constitution Act reinforces their fishing rights, any infringement, unless due to necessity of conservation, was illegitimate, and that the fishing net length restriction was not justified by mentioned conservation. From the case of R.V. Sparrow itself, in quotes, the Crown insisted on, both in this court and the courts below, that the Musqueam band's Aboriginal right to fish had been extinguished by regulations under the Fisheries Act. However, after his first 2 hearings, an appeal to the Supreme Court ended the case with the conclusion that the existing Aboriginal right to fish was not extinguished by this act. To better understand what was happening in the world during the time of the Sparrow case, it is important to look at the year 1990. This is the same year in which the Oka crisis occurred. The Oka crisis was a conflict between Mohawk protesters, the Quebec police force, and the Canadian Army. The conflict was due to a proposed expansion of a golf course in which a Mohawk burial ground was located. However, this was only the catalyst, as Mohawk voices had been silenced for generations while more and more was taken. After 98 days, the Mohawk people surrendered themselves to the armed forces, but their voices were finally heard. As mentioned previously, the ruling on the Sparrow case set a precedent for the infringement of Aboriginal rights, which is known as the Sparrow test. The Sparrow test defines whether a right has been infringed and when infringing on the right is justified. A right has been infringed if the action either imposes undue hardship on the First Nation, is considered by the court to be unreasonable, or prevents the right holder from exercising their right. An infringement may be justified if The infringement serves valid legislative objective. There has been as little infringement as possible in order to affect the desired result. If fair compensation was provided and Aboriginal groups were consulted or at the least informed. There is extended amounts of controversy associated with the Sparrow test. The majority of this controversy stems from how the Sparrow test does not guarantee Aboriginal rights, but instead gives ways to infringe on these very rights it is supposed to be protecting. The Sparrow test is far too vague when determining what an acceptable infringement, and the result is a judge who has to interpret obscurities, such as adequate compensation often means different things to different people. Consultation may not reflect the views of everybody involved. A valid legislative objective is determined by the government, and what may be considered to be as little infringement as possible can be seen as a significant infringement. There is widespread belief that the Sparrow test is flawed. Just because it has done some good does not mean that it should be allowed to do bad. Generally, the infringing of an Aboriginal rights are actions performed by the local government. There is a sense of confusion when the federal government can determine when the local government is allowed to infringe on these rights. This is often a difficult time for a lot of Aboriginal individuals and communities. The negotiations and litigations involved are extremely costly and are not something that communities can consistently afford every time an attempt is made at infringing on their rights. Here are the references associated with the information I retrieved. Thank you for listening.